The night she asked for a copy of the lease, her hands were steady in a way that didn't match her voice. She said it casually, like she was asking where we kept the extra light bulbs. I remember noticing how she didn't look at me when she said it, just traced the edge of the kitchen counter with her finger. I told myself it was nothing. People ask for paperwork all the time. Still, my chest tightened, the same way it does when you realize you've missed a step going downstairs. We were standing in the small kitchen we'd shared for almost 3 years. The fridge hummed too loud. A half-folded dish towel sat between us like a placeholder for a conversation we weren't having. She smiled after I said sure. But it was a smile that finished early, like she'd already moved on to the next thought. Later that night, I lay awake listening to her breathe. Slow. Even. Peaceful. I tried to match it, but my mind kept replaying the moment, searching for something sharper, something obvious. There wasn't anything. That was the problem. I started cataloging details instead. How she'd been packing lighter for weekend trips. How she'd stopped talking about next year and switched to eventually. How she'd been careful with money in a way that didn't include me. I told myself I was being paranoid. I was good at that. Making excuses felt like a skill I'd practiced without realizing it. Still, staring at the ceiling. I had the uneasy sense that I was guarding something that wasn't mine to keep. By morning, she was already dressed, bag by the door, coffee untouched. She kissed my cheek and said she'd call later. I watched her leave, trying to figure out why it felt less like goodbye and more like a checkpoint. When we first met, she was between places in a way that sounded temporary but felt heavy. Not homeless, not stranded, just hovering. She had a job she didn't like, a roommate situation that kept changing, and a long list of plans that never seemed to land anywhere specific. I remember thinking she just needed a little traction. I had traction. A steady apartment, predictable hours, routines that didn't excite me but didn't scare me either. When she joked that I was weirdly stable, I took it as a compliment. I didn't hear the subtext then. I just heard relief. Our early days were soft and slow. Coffee at my place because hers was always chaotic. Nights in because she was tired of pretending she wanted to be out. She'd curl up on my couch, toes tucked under my leg, and talk about what she might do someday. Not with me. Just someday. I filled in the blanks without realizing it. I assumed someday meant later, together. She never corrected me, but she never confirmed it either. She had a way of letting silence do the work for her. When her lease fell through a few months in, I told her she could stay with me for a bit. She hesitated, just long enough to look responsible, then agreed. She moved in with fewer boxes than I expected. It should have felt strange. It didn't. It felt efficient, like this was always the path of least resistance. Friends said we balanced each other out. I was grounding. She was ambitious. I liked that story. It gave us roles. It made everything make sense, but there were small moments that didn't fit. She never changed her mailing address. She never unpacked one specific suitcase. And whenever I talked about upgrading the couch or renewing the lease early, she'd smile and say, "We'll see." I thought that meant patience. Now I wonder if it meant something else entirely. I didn't notice when my apartment stopped feeling like mine. It wasn't sudden. It happened the way water erodes stone, one quiet adjustment at a time. Her shoes by the door made more sense than mine. Her favorite mug replaced the chipped one I'd had for years. The spare key ended up on her ring, not mine. I liked being needed. I won't pretend otherwise. When she talked about how calm she felt with me, how safe, it filled something I hadn't realized was empty. She slept better. Ate more regularly. Started talking about the future with more confidence. I told myself I was part of that future. There were nights she'd come home drained, sit at the edge of the bed, and let the silence stretch until I filled it. I'd make dinner, listen, nod at the right places. She'd thank me like I'd done something generous, not ordinary. That should have been my first clue. Partners don't usually thank you for stability. They expect it. Around the 1-year mark, she landed a new job. Better pay. Better title. More direction. I celebrated harder than she did. I told everyone how proud I was. She hugged me and said, I couldn't have done this without you. That sentence stayed with me. Not because it felt romantic, but because it sounded like a conclusion. Like she'd crossed a finish line and was acknowledging the support staff. After that, things shifted in small ways. She stayed later at work. Started dressing sharper. More deliberate. She'd talk about colleagues I never met, places I never went. When I asked questions, she answered, but briefly. Like she was already practicing independence. Still, she came home to me. Still slept beside me. Still let me plan things. I took that as proof. One night, half asleep, I asked her if she saw herself here long-term. She paused long enough that I woke up fully. Then she said, I don't know what long-term looks like yet. I laughed it off. Said fair enough. She rolled over. I lay there wondering why the word yet felt heavier than it should. The doubts didn't arrive as accusations. They showed up as logistics. Questions that felt practical enough to ignore. She asked about splitting expenses differently, about whose name was on which bill. She framed it like responsibility, like adulthood. I agreed to everything without pushing back. I told myself it was healthy. Around that time, she started spending more weekends away. Networking, she called it. Workshops. Conferences. Once, a last-minute trip to visit a friend she hadn't mentioned before. I never checked her stories, never asked for proof. I trusted her in the way people trust gravity. It was just there. One Sunday afternoon, I cleaned the apartment while she was gone. Not angrily. Just methodically. When I opened the hall closet, that old suitcase was still there. Same spot. Same lock. I realized I'd never seen what was inside. I didn't open it. I stood there longer than I needed to, hand on the handle, doing math in my head that didn't have numbers. How long had it been packed? How long had she needed it ready? When she got home, she was upbeat. Energized. She talked about new opportunities, maybe even a move someday. She said it lightly, like an idea floating by. I asked where. She shrugged and said, wherever it makes sense. I waited for her to say with you. She didn't. That night, I dreamed I was holding a door open while people walked past me. I woke up tired, with the taste of metal in my mouth. Over breakfast, she mentioned possibly getting her own place eventually, closer to work. She said it like a hypothetical, like she was testing how it sounded out loud. I nodded. Said we could talk about it later. She smiled, relieved. That was the moment I started suspecting something was off. Not betrayal. Not cheating. Something quieter. Like I'd agreed to a role without ever seeing the full script. The false explanation came to me the way bad ideas usually do, quietly, and all at once. I convinced myself there had to be someone else. It fit neatly. The distance. The weekends away. The way she'd started guarding her phone, not hiding it, just angling it slightly out of view. I didn't feel angry at first. I felt stupidly calm, like I'd finally solved a puzzle that had been bothering me for months. Cheating was something I understood. It had rules. Causes. Effects. It meant I'd been wronged, not misplaced. I started watching for signs. Too closely. Every delay felt suspicious. Every new name a potential threat. When she mentioned a coworker helping her prep for an interview, my stomach tightened. When she laughed at a text and didn't explain why, I memorized the sound of it. One night, she came home late and tired, shoes kicked off without ceremony. I asked, carefully, if there was someone else. The question landed heavier than I expected. She didn't get defensive. She looked confused. No, she said. Not offended. Just surprised. Why would you think that? I gave vague answers. Distance. Changes. She listened, then shook her head slowly. She told me she was overwhelmed, focused, trying to get her footing. She said the pressure wasn't about us. She even apologized for making me feel insecure. That should have reassured me. Instead, it unsettled me more. There was no crack in her story. No guilt. No secrecy. Just sincerity that didn't include me the way I needed it to. Later, lying in bed, I realized something uncomfortable. If she were cheating, at least I'd still be the partner she was betraying. The alternative was worse. The alternative was that I was exactly where she needed me to be, and nowhere she planned to stay. After that conversation, I tried to act normal. I stopped watching her phone. Stopped counting weekends. I told myself I'd made it weird and needed to reset. On the surface, things improved. She relaxed. Laughed more. The tension eased in a way that felt earned, like we'd cleared the air, but something else crept in to replace it. She started treating me like a fixed object. Dependable. Unchanging. When she talked about her plans, they sounded polished, rehearsed, like elevator pitches. When she talked about me, it was always in the present tense. Never forward. Never conditional. One evening, she asked if I'd be okay renewing the lease on my own if things got complicated. She said it like she was asking about weather patterns. I stared at her, waiting for the rest of the sentence. It never came. I asked what she meant by complicated. She said she didn't want to make promises she couldn't keep. She said she was finally figuring out who she was, and that sometimes meant making hard choices. I wanted to ask where I fit into that. Instead, I asked if she was unhappy with me. She said no, quickly. Almost too quickly. Then she said something that stuck. "You've always been solid," she said. "That's why this worked." Worked. Past tense. I nodded, because nodding was easier than admitting I didn't know what she meant. That night, I sat on the couch long after she went to bed. The apartment felt like a waiting room. I realized she wasn't pulling away in anger or secrecy. She was detaching with gratitude. Like someone thanking a bridge after crossing it, the thought made my chest ache in a dull, spreading way. Not heartbreak. Something quieter. The sense that the job I'd been doing so well was almost over. The confirmation didn't come as a confession. It came as a calendar invite. She asked if we could talk seriously on a Tuesday night, after dinner, before bed. Not a fight. Not an emergency. Scheduled, like a meeting you don't want but can't avoid. All day at work, I couldn't focus. I kept checking the time, irritated by how normal everything looked around me. She cooked that night. One of my favorites. I noticed how carefully she plated it, like presentation mattered more than appetite. We ate slowly. Neither of us reached for our phones. The silence felt practiced. She started by thanking me. For everything. For being patient. For giving her space when she needed it. For supporting her when she didn't know where she was headed. Each sentence landed gently, but together they formed something heavy. Then she said she'd accepted an opportunity. A big one. Out of reach before. Somewhere else. Not permanent, she said, but open-ended. A step she couldn't not take. I asked where that left us. She paused. Not because she didn't know, but because she was choosing her words carefully. She said she didn't want to pretend this was something it wasn't. She said she never wanted to lie to me. She said she cared about me deeply. What she didn't say was that she wanted to stay. The truth finally settled into place. She hadn't been planning a future with me. She'd been planning a future from me. Using what we had to become who she needed to be. I asked if she'd known this all along. She didn't answer directly. Just said things change when you feel safe enough to imagine more. I nodded. Again. I was very good at nodding. She moved out in stages. A box here. A bag there. No dramatic deadline. No slammed doors. Just a gradual reclaiming of space that had once been shared. Each time something disappeared, the apartment felt less like a home and more like evidence. We were polite. Careful. She slept in the spare room her last week, saying it would make things easier. It didn't. I listened to the unfamiliar silence, the absence of her breathing on the other side of the wall. It felt like the building itself was holding its breath. On her final day, she hugged me longer than necessary. Said she hoped we could stay in touch. Said I deserved someone who could meet me where I was. I told her I was glad she'd found her path. It was true. That didn't make it hurt less. After she left, I walked through the apartment touching things she hadn't taken. The couch she'd never wanted to replace. The mug she forgot. The empty closet where the suitcase had finally been unzipped and gone. What unsettled me most wasn't that she'd left. It was realizing she hadn't lied. She'd been honest in pieces. I just assembled them into a story that made sense to me. I keep wondering if I was generous or naive. If love is still love when one person knows it has an expiration date. If being someone's safe place is meaningful even if you're never meant to be their destination, I don't resent her. I don't forgive myself either. So here's the question I'm stuck with, and maybe you can answer it better than I can. Am I wrong for feeling used, even if I agreed to every step along the way?